As I've mained my 2023 MacBook Pro for a solid 9 months, I've started to really enjoy some of the features it offers, like the battery life, the performance, and the display. In this video, I'm going to take a computer, which is pretty much the exact opposite of my 2023 MacBook Pro, and I'm going to use it in 2024 to see what tasks I can perform with it. This MacBook Pro is missing some of the features that I've been using on my Apple Silicon Macs for a couple of years now, such as the haptic trackpad, or Touch ID, or the mini LED display. Simply using this computer for basic tasks, such as writing documents and basic web browsing, drains the battery at a really fast rate. Luckily, this computer does support MagSafe in the form of a MagSafe 1 port, so it's not that far off from my 2023 MacBook Pro. But MagSafe 1 feels looser and easier to disconnect than MagSafe 3 does. After I patched Monterey onto this Mac and I got it set up, the experience isn't awful. There are some visual glitches once in a while, not related to the GPU, but it's a pretty solid experience overall when it comes to playing animations and opening apps. One thing that I quickly learned was that Final Cut Pro does not function properly here. Neither does iMovie from what I've heard. Whether it's my version of Final Cut or the patcher, I don't know, but it doesn't open properly. I'm sure I could probably get this to work properly if I put enough time into it, but I don't really see that being worth it as I do use Premiere Pro as a secondary editing software. The speakers on this laptop are definitely out of 2011, and they sound worse than almost any Apple product I've ever used. These speakers seriously sound worse than some of my PowerPC machines from the 2000s. What was Apple doing with the speakers when they designed the unibody MacBook Pro in the late 2000s? As for the display, while some brightness has been lost over time, it's a decent panel. The viewing angles are not half bad from side to side, although the colors get completely washed out when viewing it from above or below eye level. macOS really does look different when viewed on a non-Retina display though, and it's apparent by looking at something like the Control Center menu or the dock. I went into this not expecting it to compare to my main MacBook Pro, but I expected to compare it to other computers of the time, and even other MacBooks of the time, and honestly, this panel wasn't bad for the time. Nowadays, mini LED, OLED, even higher quality LCD panels exist, but for what it is, this computer's panel is pretty good for the price range of the computer is, for the age of the computer, and even just in general, it's still an okay panel. I don't see any major issues with it. It just does feel a little bit old when using it sometimes, and the resolution could be higher, considering this is a 15.4-inch display. The Wi-Fi 4 card in this laptop is definitely showing its age. I can still pull upwards of 300 megabits per second down from this laptop, and I have seen some people try upgrading these computers to Wi-Fi 5, but there isn't a clear answer online as to whether or not these machines could be upgraded past 802.11n or Wi-Fi 4. This laptop does support Ethernet as well, but more on the ports later. Of course, with Wi-Fi, this laptop also included Bluetooth 2.1 connectivity, which is something I haven't tested, but it should get the job done for Bluetooth connectivity, even though this era of Bluetooth was a little bit spotty. The keyboard is something that is constantly interacted with on a laptop, and the keyboard on this computer is something that I've spent a lot of time using, as this video's entire script was written on this keyboard. And I have to say, Apple's newer keyboards fixed all of my issues that I have with these older Macs. The keyboard feels a little bit mushy, and the key travel is overall good, and anyone who's used a Mac older than 2016 would just feel right at home with this keyboard. But it definitely is not the greatest keyboard of all time. I don't like the shape of the keys either, but that's more of an appearance thing, as I prefer the more rounded, newer style Apple keys that they've been using on these Apple Silicon Macs. The more that I use this machine, the more I notice the fan noise. Generally, I'm used to silence on my 2023 MacBook Pro and even my Mac Studio, but having this fan run in the background reminds me of my last generation Intel machines, such as my 16-inch MacBook Pro, which I really liked. It's not the biggest annoyance, but it definitely does break the silence in the room. More on battery life, this machine being 12 years old and an Intel laptop running software from 2021 is definitely not the greatest contender. Even comparing it to some of the other Intel laptops that I've used, it's bad. It's just downright bad. Given its age, this is acceptable because batteries do not last forever and they do degrade pretty quickly, honestly. But also, with that said, Anyone who wants to use this laptop should be aware of the potential and, honestly, certain battery issues. I would assume that replacing the battery would help this machine last longer, but Intel was never great on battery life in the first place. With nearly 1,000 charge cycles and under 80% battery health, this laptop's battery has lasted much longer than I expected it to be, but it definitely has seen better days. Next, for a topic that a lot of people bring up when discussing this laptop. This is something that people praise this laptop for constantly, and that is the ports. In almost every review of this laptop and every retrospective, the ports are brought up, because this was one of the last MacBooks to have a full arrangement of legacy ports, featuring Gigabit Ethernet, FireWire 800, Thunderbolt 1, a pair of USB 2.0 ports, an SD card slot, and audio jacks. This computer already has a clear advantage over new laptops, right? That's not exactly correct though, as it wouldn't make sense to just remove ports for no reason. This laptop's port array lacks in one major thing, and that is speed. The most powerful of these ports, Thunderbolt, was released all the way back in 2011 with a data transfer rate of 10 gigabits per second. This means that the most powerful port on this computer, which was rarely adopted by anyone except for professional manufacturers, is just as powerful as USB-C 3.1. This is really the issue with these ports, as USB 2 has a data transfer rate of 480 megabits per second. The issue here is that while USB 2.0 can support older generation accessories, such as keyboards, mice, when transferring data from a USB drive or an external drive of any sort, this computer will not be able to perform nearly as well as most people would want. Going into the future, as more and more accessories use USB-C, this computer will start to lose support as well, as USB-A's days are really numbered, and the entire industry has decided that USB Type-C is the future. Apple even put it on their phones. But Thunderbolt 1 is more powerful than USB 2, by a lot. Although the average hard drive or USB stick did not support Thunderbolt 1, and the only things that really did support Thunderbolt 1 included professional equipment, some consumer drives, and things like the Apple Thunderbolt display, making the port more or less useless in 2024. The same goes for FireWire 800, although it has a higher data transfer rate than USB 2 did at 800 megabits per second, although the same issue holds true as with Thunderbolt 1, as support for FireWire 800 drives is very limited. I've never seen any FireWire accessories in person. That really raises the question, is backwards compatibility worth all this speed loss? I don't think so personally, but technically, FireWire 800 can be converted down to FireWire 400, and FireWire 400 can sync original iPods and stuff like the Apple iSight camera from back in 2005, but I don't really know how useful that stuff would be to the average person in 2024, being mostly 20-year-old tech. I like the included Ethernet port though. It's something that newer, thinner laptops have excluded, although it still functions just as well as it did when the laptop came out. And seeing as most people don't have an internet plan capable of anything over a gigabit, this port should work pretty well for a long time. I also didn't mention the DVD SuperDrive, which is something that a lot of people will probably not use. The SuperDrive can play standard DVDs or CDs, and it can be used to install some things from DVD, although most software that can be installed from DVD does not support any macOS over maybe High Sierra. That's about all. It's not exactly that exciting. Many people can just replace the DVD with a SATA drive bay, and that'll give some extra storage with another SSD or hard drive, or just remove it entirely for better cooling performance. I've seen some people do that too. I've always liked high performance computers, and when this laptop came out, it was a pretty high performance machine. Unfortunately, after years of age, this laptop does not perform nearly as well as it did when it came out. Playing basic games on this computer results in less than 20 FPS, even with the quad-core 2.5 GHz i7. And then another pretty big issue with this is that if this laptop heats up too much from intensive tasks, the GPU will start becoming an issue as well and probably fail. So the laptop is really just a bunch of problems for demanding tasks. After editing on this laptop for a night, I can say that it's not great on Premiere Pro, although it exceeded my expectations. I don't think that this computer should be purchased by anybody who remotely needs a lot of performance. There really isn't anywhere to go with the performance of this computer, as it just doesn't perform as well as most people would hope for gaming, editing, or other demanding tasks, which makes sense seeing as this laptop is from 2011 and it probably had overheating issues when it came out as well. First, I want to go over my specs. This is a late 2011 15-inch MacBook Pro. From the factory, it has a second-gen Intel Core i7 processor which can run at 2.5 GHz. That is pretty much the only thing stock about this laptop, as I've upgraded the DDR3 RAM to 12 GB at 1600 MHz. I've put a 500 GB Samsung 860 EVO SSD in it. On that SSD, I've installed macOS Monterey using a patcher. I've also replaced the default glossy display with a much better, in my opinion, matte textured anti-glare display. One thing that tech enthusiasts would probably have to note about this laptop in specific is that it is notorious for GPU failures. This laptop has not had that yet, as its Radeon HD 6770M graphics chip is still functional with all of its 1 whole gigabyte of VRAM. To lessen the odds of it failing, I've set a custom fan curve to keep it from warming up too much. The question becomes, how much did all of this cost? For the laptop, I traded an iPhone 7 to get it, and then the SSD is one that I've had laying around that I purchased in 2019, but I can find the exact SSD on eBay used for $25. I've had the RAM laying around too, taken from an old HP EliteBook, but to get a pair of 1600 MHz 8GB sticks, totaling 16 gigabytes, it would cost $22, so I'm going to call the RAM at $20. With tax and shipping, this anti-glare display cost me $26.44, and it was a used OEM panel in fair condition with some dents on the back and a small light spot on the display. An upgrade which I've ordered but hasn't yet arrived is a conversion kit to turn my DVD super drive into a second drive caddy, so I can run dual hard drives in this machine, and that cost me $4.23 after tax and shipping, although I won't factor that in because it has not arrived yet. All in all, this computer's build would cost $71.44 before factoring in the cost of the computer itself. I could make back some money by selling the old display, hard drive, and RAM, but a base price to see how much you would be spending on upgrades to get a machine similar to mine is $71.44. That entire segment of the video that you just saw was edited using Adobe Premiere Pro on this MacBook Pro. So first, I recorded with my iPhone 15 Pro with the DJI Mimo app, which is what I use to record a lot of my B-roll. Now, after that, because the 4K footage that my iPhone produces would not run that well with this processor, I used a free app called Handbrake to pretty much transcode the video to a more efficient format for this computer in basic terms. And then I put that footage onto the computer, and I edit with Premiere Pro. So my second note that I do not use Premiere Pro daily. I use Final Cut Pro on my MacBook Pro all the time, but I have not edited primarily in Premiere Pro for a number of years now. So I don't know as much on Premiere Pro as I know on Final Cut Pro. That's why some parts of the video looked choppy. If I knew Premiere Pro well, or if I was able to get Final Cut on this laptop, it would look a lot better just because I'm more used to Final Cut. But as for performance, this part of the video, completely unscripted by the way, it was acceptable. It was a lot better than I expected it to be. But by no means is this computer going to be a good daily workstation computer for this type of stuff. This computer definitely had a lot of slowdown while scrubbing through the timeline, and importing footage and putting it into the timeline really did not play well. The fans were at full blast, the entire computer was just struggling to handle this footage, and I would say, overall, if this was the only computer I had and I had access to Handbrake and all that, it would be okay. But as it stands right now, this computer really is not that good for editing. But I will say, it did better than I expected. So after using this laptop for some pretty basic tasks, and even some more intensive tasks, what do I think about it? I still don't think that people should go out and buy these. Not only because they're not exactly great right now, especially for intensive tasks, but because they are still aging. They are old computers at this point. These computers are, 13 years old at this point, 12 years old, and they're not getting any newer, and they're not really getting any better. And while they can be upgraded, the CPU, GPU are both not socketed, they're both on the board, soldered down, so those are going to be from 2011 forever. And the computer's design is not getting any better. The display, while it did impress me, it wasn't amazing. And a lot of the times, some newer, cheaper Chromebooks or Windows laptops just absolutely beat this computer out. I'm not saying that those computers are for everyone, but that's just my thoughts on this computer. Keep in mind, this was not stock. This computer had a lot of upgrades that I mentioned earlier in the video. But with all that said, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this video was enjoyable, and goodbye.